Welcome to you all, and good afternoon. Uh, Thanks for coming and supporting this seminar. And by way of supporting this seminar, supporting the CAL's Gender Aware Initiative. Thanks to the CAL's Gender Aware Initiative for giving me the travel grant, which made it possible for one of my field trips. So in today's, the title of today's talk is Class, Caste, and Patriarchy, Emerging Contradictions from Off-Farm Employment in India. So I'll give you a brief presentation outline, where first I'll talk about the research question and the typology of employment in rural India, followed by the implications of the research study. Thereafter, the animating debates on feminization and defeminization of farm labor in India, and then go into the data which I am using, some of the preliminary results and summary findings. So the research question, which is continuously gets shaped, and this is where this travel grant comes in, that when we write this proposal and how do we keep on refining this question, the question here is, under the current scenario of men's increasing access to off-farm employment and these animating debates on feminization and defeminization, the purpose of this study is to examine the following question. What is the effect of men's off-farm employment on women's economic roles in rural India? So I'll talk briefly about off-farm employment and labor mobility. So the term off-farm employment, there is a lot of terminological confusion about this. In the literature, they use the word non-farm employment, pluri-activity, multiple activity, off-farm employment. So the first task here in this project was to tease out what exactly is off-farm employment, and then fit it to the context of my research. So off-farm employment involves all economic activities carried out off the owner's own farm. It includes wage employment in agriculture on others' farm, along with non-farm employment, like construction and manufacturing. So to talk about labor mobility, which is getting more complex in India, and I'll talk more about this in the next slide, first kind of mobility which we are aware of is occupational mobility. For example, jobs in construction versus farm labor. The spatial movement of people. They're working in their own village, or there is rural to rural migration, or there is daily commuting, different forms of spatial mobility. And the temporal mobility, about people migrating for a period of 6 months, or they're going and coming back to work daily. So to give you a typology of rural employment in India, let's look at this chart where I talk about farm work. Farm work essentially refers to the cultivation and own farm management. Then there's the category of off-farm agricultural work, which includes livestock and poultry rearing and farm labor. And then comes the non-farm work category, which is of construction and manufacturing and other kinds of non-farm jobs. Now this varies both spatially, temporally, as I said, and occupationally. So to give you an idea of the structure of employment and population by gender in rural India, I have this example of the macroeconomic trends. So what is happening in rural India at the macroeconomic level? The growth in agriculture is declining by 2% in employment. The industrial employment is increasing by 1%, and the construction is the major source of employment growth. Rural construction is the major source of off-farm employment growth in India. So what is the motivation for rural off-farm employment? The first reason which comes up frequently is the higher income as the major reason to seek off-farm employment. This has been well documented and again documented. But what has been less documented and is now getting increasing importance is that off-farm employment provides significant opportunities to build human and social capital. For example, one of these studies by Sujit Datta looks at why people move towards off-farm employment, and he says that they form networks to challenge the legitimacy of the existing caste and class hierarchies in rural India. So his research shows over a period of time that they daily commute from their villages, even if there is no improvement in their economic condition. And so this is getting significant recently. The other reason is that it repudiates institutionalized forms of authority and control that are exercised through the rural labor process. What I mean by that is look at the patron-client labor relations or relations of debt bondage. So the off-farm employment opportunities provide an escape from these patron-client labor relations, and this is something which is significant. I'll refer back to this when I get to the results. However, not to overstate the case, the experience of autonomy from off-farm employment is partial and incomplete. So as Nicholas Rose would say, access to off-farm employment provides no escape from work, but provides for emancipation in work. So what are the implications of this research? The most important implication is to look at how the livelihood patterns, household livelihood patterns are getting diversified due to these complex labor mobility patterns. So this challenges the classical thesis of agrarian transition, i.e. the movement of the workers from the rural to the urban. So Barbara Harris White and Alpa Shah have this study where they say that the prototypical image of farm workers moving to the urban factory is inadequate in explaining the recent labor market changes with respect to rural India. The transition from the rural to the urban was very predominant in the 70s, the 80s, but from the 90s and the 2000s, this has become more complex. The second is the relationship between work and women's relative empowerment. There are contested debates over relationship between women's access to work opportunities and their relative empowerment in the household. Mere access to work doesn't necessarily translate into relative empowerment in the household. Second are understanding the perceptions about work. For instance, a relatively well-off woman who manages the household farm might associate occupational mobility with caste considerations. In contrast, for a woman migrant worker in construction who associates occupational mobility to class. So I think the perceptions around work are significant to understand how people feel about empowerment, relative empowerment. The third is the contradictory effects of employment generation policies. So for instance, the direct impact of off-farm employment programs on workers and households could be at variance with its effect on the local rural economy. For instance, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme is supposed to have a very positive effect on relative women's empowerment, but at the stage of asset creation, it lags far behind. So there are these contradictory effects which come to the fore. The fourth is the reorganization of the farm labor market in the Indian countryside. So the contradictory outcomes of women's labor market participation may reveal how the competing priorities of economic development are often juxtaposed against each other. So the study by Finnish on millet cultivation talks about why these women have moved from millet cultivation to producing cassava or growing cassava. Though millet is supposed to be nutritive and healthy, and they are aware of this, but they have moved because the labor time they save is considerable. So it leads to better labor conditions, but these are achieved at the expense of household nutritive health security. Then I move on to the debates on feminization and defeminization of farm work in rural India. So what are the major debates? The feminization of farm work refers to increase in the relative share of employment available to women as compared to men in agriculture. What does this involve? One of the significant types is agricultural wage work versus own farm management, which is becoming greater, and I'll refer to this when I show the results. The other is some of the new tasks which were previously done by men, like the threshing operations, labor recruitment, and farm supervision. That is being increasingly done by women now, and as when the men are moving away for off-farm employment. The counter-narrative of defeminization talks about women being withdrawn from the labor force. And so there are some studies which talk about this. And one of the reasons is the increase in women's education. And these studies are all at the macro level. So there are these studies that women are getting educated and therefore, going back to school, or they are finding better opportunities. The second is that the average incomes of these households are increasing, so they can afford to, go back and study or find different employment. The third is the issue of patriarchy and production of social status. And this is very significant because there are some studies which show that these upper caste women are being asked to be at home because there is a social status which is associated with farm work, and therefore they're being kept away from managing the farm. And so there's a tension in these debates. But what I find is that there is more micro-level evidence which is required to capture the nuances in this debate. So then I move to the data and the preliminary findings. So the data I'm using is collected by the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, called ICRISAT, in Hyderabad, India. So this is a household-level panel data collected for 6 Indian villages from Andhra Pradesh and Maharashtra. And this is collected between 1975 to 2012, but this is an unbalanced panel, and I'll just show you that in a minute. So the choice of villages is based on a variety of cropping patterns, land use, and irrigation facilities. The households which are sampled are representative of the 4 categories in the rural economy: the landless labor, so small, medium, and large farmer land holdings. The household sample size across the 6 villages was 240 in 1975 and 600 in 2012. It's an unbalanced panel because ICRISAT lost funding in some of the years, so they couldn't fund data collection. The secondary data, this accounts for the panel attrition. What that means is that if there is a loss of households due to death or migration or lack of participation, then they account for this panel data. And the gender empowerment module is available starting 2009, because this was funded in 2009. So some general comments about data and hypothesis. So why is this data set exciting? Because this data can be used to examine changes in employment for men and women over time. So the ICRISAT data is available for the period during which major transformations have occurred in Indian rural labor markets. And the hypothesis here is that the changes in men's employment status is driving women's participation in the Indian rural labor market. There are possibilities that the changes in men's and women's economic roles might mutually drive each other. So there is this bidirectionality, which will be only teased out when I do the empirical research further. So just to note the categories before we go into some results is to see how agricultural work is defined in ICRISAT, in the context of ICRISAT. Agricultural work here includes cultivation, livestock rearing, and farm labor. Non-agricultural work includes non-farm labor, salaried business, and a whole bunch of other work like taxi drivers and all that, which is clubbed under the others category. So the first important result is to look at these aggregate changes in the agricultural employment for these 6 villages from 1975 to 2010. And so you find that for males, there is a significant decline in the participation in agriculture, whereas for females, it's pretty much at the aggregate level stays the same. One of the significant changes which you find in employment within agriculture is that for the male attached laborers, attached or bonded laborers, there is a significant decline from 1970s to 2010. And the consequence of this I'll just discuss in a further slide, what the implication of this is.
Like an indenture?
Yes, indentured labor is another word they use. Thanks, David. The other significant result here is that within agriculture, women are increasingly taking to cultivation, which was our original sort of hypothesis that at the preliminary level, you find that there are significant changes of women taking more into cultivation and own farm managers. So the summary of these findings, the share of farm workers in the rural male workforce has declined from 88 to 63%. And these is percentage households. But for women, as I said, there's a marginal decline in the share of farm workers in the rural female workforce. But trends within agriculture, this is where the action lies. The decline in the share of attached laborers among the rural male workforce. So one of the things which I said when I alluded to the motivations of off-farm employment is to contest these feudal patron-client relationships is observed here, that there is reduced dependency on feudal or patron-client relationships. Now, there was this Bonded Labor System Act, which was in place in 1976, but it took a long time for this to come into effect because the off-farm employment opportunities were not available. So the transition is sure, but slower. The second is increase in the share of cultivators among the rural female workforce. And so this implies that there is a growing role of women as farm managers or own farm workers. Now, if I'm trying to look at this using caste and gender, I get very similar results. So to look at the forward or upper caste males, you find that for upper caste males, there is hardly a decline in their participation in agriculture. And one of the reasons possibly is because they have this land, and so they are stuck with that land. Whereas if you look at backward caste males, I'm just taking the example here of the scheduled caste, because there are multiple categories. You will find that there is a significant decline in their participation in agriculture. And one of the categories which I'll discuss later is that they have moved from being farm workers to taking non-farm employment. And these is the group which was also working as indentured labor. So now I'm getting the same sort of result using caste and gender. What about upper caste females? So virtually their participation in this data sample in agriculture was 100% in 75. And now some of them have moved towards non-farm employment, but predominantly they're still in agriculture. But what within agriculture? We'll talk about it further. For lower caste females, their participation in agriculture was also 100%. They have moved towards some non-agricultural jobs, but predominantly they still work in agriculture. Okay, so within agriculture, what is the scenario for upper caste females? Earlier, about 92% were working as agricultural laborers, and only 8% were farm managers or were under cultivation. But this is where you see the dramatic change that from 8 to 78% of them have now become own farm managers, or they have moved towards cultivation. And this is also important because managing the own farm doesn't get accounted in labor statistics. Similarly, with the lower caste females, it's more nuanced. About 100, all of them were in agricultural labor. But now, about 64% are still in agricultural labor, and 32% have moved towards cultivation. So they are either having small parcels of land, or they're assisting, their husbands or their counterparts in farm management. So what is the summary of these preliminary findings from the caste and gender? The majority of the male members of the forward caste are still dependent on farming. These occupational changes, as I said, are slower here, possibly because they're attached to the land. They're stuck with that land. In contrast, for backward castes like scheduled caste, dependence on farming has declined. The major shift is from agricultural to non-agricultural labor. On an aggregate level, for women of both forward and scheduled caste, the share of non-agricultural work has increased. However, within agriculture, the dependency of female members of the forward caste on cultivation has increased considerably from 8 to 77%, from 75 to 2010. And while the dependence of female members of the scheduled caste on cultivation has increased from almost 0% in 75 to 32% in 2010, most of these scheduled caste women still continue to work as agricultural labor. So what are the future directions I'm taking in this research? So the next step is to examine the determinants of off-farm employment over time. So the dependent variable which I'm trying to use here is the employment status of the individual. And the categories I'm using are the categories of unemployed, farm work, the non-farm worker, and a mixed category of farm and non-farm work. Because as I said, a lot of these people are working part-time for farm work and part-time non-farm work. And then to examine what are the effects of these moderating variables like class, caste, and patriarchy on women's changing economic roles. So one of the things which here is the size of landholding will be used as a proxy for class. The household composition as a proxy for patriarchy. The presence of so there is data available on whether who are the people present in the household, whether the mother-in-law is present, the father-in-law is present, and they have detailed information in the gender module. And then you're controlling for a variety of effects, one predominantly being the region, and then age, education, marital status, and the distance to the nearest city. Because I think this is becoming very important with access to better transportation and also the mobile telephones and so on. So this is where I'm heading. Thank you.